self-reflection?
Well, the essay itself starts off with a pretty strong call for radical self-reflection, especially for Baha'is.
Whoa, radical self-reflection. Okay, that sounds intense. What's that all about?
So it's kind of acknowledging that gap,
Yeah.
the one between what we say we believe and how we actually act sometimes.
I see. Like saying we're all about welcoming everyone, but then maybe subtly pressuring newcomers to fit in a specific way.
Exactly. And that contradiction is what the essay really digs into.
It's definitely a paradox, isn't it? Makes you wonder how often we do stuff like that without even realizing it.
All the time, probably.
The essay also talks about how cultural baggage can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings. Like, what are some of the biggest takeaways there?
Well, it brings up the influx of refugees into Western countries as a prime example.
Okay, yeah.
And how there's often this expectation for them to, assimilate super quickly into the dominant culture.
Right. Learn the language, adopt the customs, all that.
Yeah, and sometimes with this underlying feeling that if they don't, they're somehow holding back the faith's progress.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty interesting point. Could you unpack that a little bit? Like, why is that expectation potentially problematic, especially within a faith that's, all about unity?
Well, put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you're a refugee. You've already experienced so much upheaval and loss.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you arrive in a new place, and there's this constant pressure, whether it's spoken or unspoken, to change who you are in order to truly belong.
It's almost like saying, you're welcome here, but only if you become like us.
Yeah, exactly. And that can create this sense of isolation, like you can never truly be yourself.
Right. It kind of defeats the purpose of unity, doesn't it? And it makes me think about the early Christians.
Oh, how so?
Well, they managed to spread their faith across vastly different cultures, right? Despite language barriers and all sorts of other differences.
That's a great point. And the essay actually uses that as a counterexample. It argues that if the early Christians could connect despite such huge differences, maybe language fluency shouldn't be the ultimate measure of connection in a faith community today.
So if language isn't the main barrier, what is it? What else is the essay saying is causing these divisions?
Well, one of the biggest culprits, according to the essay, is this idea of comfort zones.
Comfort zones.
Yeah. Like we tend to judge anything outside of our own cultural bubble way more harshly.
Okay, I can see that. Like, we're more comfortable with what's familiar.
Right. And the essay even gives this really striking example.
Oh, what's that?
It compares how, say, Western Baha'is might celebrate Halloween without a second thought,
Okay, yeah.
but then might criticize Persian Baha'is for maintaining their own cultural practices.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good example.
It's like a double standard, right?
Totally. It makes you think, are we holding others to a different standard than we hold ourselves? Something to ponder for sure.
Definitely. And the essay brings up another point that I found kind of surprising.
Oh, what's that?
Lingering superstitions within the Baha'i community.
Really? I thought that was interesting too, especially since the teachings are pretty clear about, not believing in superstitions. So how did the essay address that?
Well, you'd think a faith so focused on unity and reason would have moved past superstitions completely, right?
You would think.
But the essay argues that these biases can be super subtle,
Okay.
and they pop up in all sorts of unexpected ways.
Like what are some examples of those subtle biases?
One example is that tendency to prioritize outward achievements,
Like what kind of achievements?
like administrative accomplishments, for example,
Yeah.
over genuine spiritual growth. It's almost like checking boxes instead of actually, engaging deeply with the teachings.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And another example is harboring a sense of cultural superiority.
Which, of course, totally contradicts the whole idea of unity.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
right.
like we're still holding on to these remnants of prejudice without even realizing it.
That's a good reminder that we need to constantly be checking ourselves. But the essay doesn't just point out the problems, does it?
No, not at all.
It also talks about what Baha'u'llah himself said about all this.
Right.
What teachings did the essay highlight?
It specifically highlighted the Kitab-i-Quine,
The Book of Certitude, right?
yes, which is like a foundational text in the Baha'i faith. And in it, Baha'u'llah talks about this need to detach from inherited beliefs and to approach truth with an open mind. He even says that doing so will allow you to perceive the sweetness of the utterances of the holy ones and discover the hidden mysteries of the words of truth.
Wow. That's beautiful. But how exactly does deep study, like really digging into the teachings, help us combat stuff like cultural bias or clinging to superstitions?
Think of it this way. Deep study forces you to grapple with tough questions and constantly evolve your understanding of the faith. It's not about blindly accepting what you've been taught.
It's more about actively engaging with it.
Exactly. And questioning it and growing your understanding over time.
So instead of taking things at face value, we're like really digging into the teachings and challenging our own assumptions.
Exactly. And the essay actually uses the story of Mullah Hussein, one of the Bab's first followers, as an example of this.
Okay, tell me about Mullah Hussein. What makes his story relevant here?
Well, Mullah Hussein was this prominent Islamic scholar back in the day. And the Bab, who's considered a prophet in the Baha'i faith, was a young man when he announced his mission. So for Mullah Hussein to accept the Bab's teachings, it meant like totally abandoning all these preconceived notions and challenging the religious establishment. It was a huge act of like detachment and faith.
Yeah, that takes a lot of courage to let go of everything you thought you knew.
Right. And the essay is saying that's kind of what we all need to do. It's not about erasing our past, but understanding how it shapes us and being open to new possibilities.
That's a powerful message for sure. This is already giving me a lot to think about. But before we get too deep into the philosophy of it all, I'm kind of curious about the practical side of things. What are some actual, like, actionable takeaways from this essay? What can our listeners do to actually bridge these divides in their own lives?
Well, the essay actually outlines a few key steps, and they all revolve around, like, action and changing behavior, not just our thoughts.
That sounds like a great place to pick up in part 2. I can't wait to hear more about those actionable steps.
We'll dive into those next time, so stay tuned. You know, it's so interesting to think about how that concept of detachment from inherited beliefs plays out in different contexts. Like, the essay focuses on the Baha'i faith, but I feel like it's something everyone can relate to, regardless of your religious background.
Totally. I mean, we all inherit beliefs and biases from somewhere, right? Our families, our culture, even the media we consume. It's like we're born into these prepackaged worldviews without even realizing it.
Exactly. And those beliefs can be so powerful even if we don't consciously realize they're shaping our thoughts and actions.
So how do we even begin to, untangle ourselves from all that? It feels like such a huge task.
It is a process, for sure. But the essay offers some really helpful insights. Remember that example of Mullah Hussein we talked about earlier, the Islamic scholar who embraced the Bab's teachings?
Yeah, his story really stuck with me.
He had to, challenge everything he thought he knew.
It took so much courage to make that kind of shift.
And that courage is a key takeaway here. Detachment doesn't mean just rejecting everything you've been taught.
Right.
It's about developing the critical thinking skills to really examine those beliefs.
Okay.
To question where they came from, and to consider other perspectives.
So it's not about erasing our past, but more about understanding how it shapes our present and being open to growth.
Exactly. And that understanding can help us identify those areas where our inherited beliefs might be holding us back.
Holding us back from what?
From connecting with others, from seeing the world more clearly, from really growing as individuals. It's about recognizing that our worldview isn't the only one.
Right, and it's not necessarily the right one either.
Exactly.
Okay, that all makes sense, but let's be real for a second. Questioning your deeply held beliefs, that can be kind of scary. It's like shaking the foundation of who you are.
It can be unsettling, absolutely. But the essay argues that it's a necessary step in our personal growth. If it is something I've been taught to believe.
So it's like hitting the pause button before we react.
Exactly. That pause gives us the space to examine our assumptions.
And consider other perspectives.
Right. It also gives us the opportunity to consider if our reaction is in line with the kind of person we want to be and the world we want to create.
I like that. The essay also talked about deep study as a way to challenge our beliefs. What specific recommendations did it make?
Remember, the essay talked about how Baha'u'llah emphasized a dynamic process of questioning and growth. It's not about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with ideas that challenge us.
So it's not just about reading books or listening to lectures. It's about really wrestling with those concepts.
Exactly. Debating them, testing them against our own experiences, and really getting to the core of things.
And that can be uncomfortable.
It can be, but that's where the real learning happens. That's how we break down those walls we were talking about.
So the essay emphasizes study and self-reflection, but what about our outward actions? What are some things we can actually do to bridge cultural divides? You mentioned some concrete steps at the end of the last part.
Oh, yeah. The essay suggests a few very practical things we can do. First, it highlights the importance of cultivating empathy.
Empathy. Okay.
And this could look like hosting intercultural gatherings where people can share their traditions and learn from each other.
I love that. Sharing food, music, stories, it's such a powerful way to connect.
Exactly. Or it could be something as simple as taking the time to really listen to someone from a different background.
Really listen with an open mind and heart.
Yeah. Another powerful suggestion is to rethink how we define success.
Redefine success.
Yeah. Instead of focusing on numerical growth, like, say, the number of new converts to a religion, we should prioritize building authentic relationships.
Based on love and service?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's about moving away from a transactional mindset and focusing on genuine connection.
That's beautiful. What was that third step the essay highlighted?
The third step is to actively create spaces for deep study and dialogue, especially those that push boundaries and challenge those comfort zones we've been talking about.
So, like, instead of just staying within our own cultural or religious groups, we could actively seek out opportunities to engage with people who hold different beliefs.
Exactly. It's about being willing to step outside of our echo chambers and engage with different ideas, even if they make us feel uncomfortable.
This is making me reevaluate some of my own assumptions and behaviors for sure. But before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. This idea that we inherit beliefs from the media we consume. That feels especially relevant today with so much information and misinformation bombarding us constantly.
It's incredibly relevant. And it ties directly into this concept of detachment we've been discussing. It's not just about questioning the beliefs we've inherited from our families or cultures. It's also about critically examining the information we're taking in from the media.
So we're talking about media literacy here, being able to analyze what we're reading and watching.
Exactly. But how do we even begin to do that with so much coming at us from all directions? That's a great question.
It is. And I think that's a perfect place to pick up in part 3.
Sounds good to me.
Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up our deep dive right where we left off, talking about how to detach from inherited beliefs, even the ones we get from the media. There's just so much information out there these days.
They can feel overwhelming, right? Especially with so much misinformation mixed in. It's like you said, it's a minefield.
Exactly. So how do we navigate that? How do we develop that critical eye when it comes to the media we consume?
Well, fact-checking is definitely a good starting point. But like I said before, it goes deeper than that.
Okay, yeah.
It's about understanding the biases that shape the information we see and hear.
So it's not just about whether something is factually accurate. It's about understanding the motivations behind it.
Exactly. Every piece of media, every story, comes from a particular perspective. And that perspective is going to influence how the information is presented.
So how do we, uncover those perspectives? It feels like a lot to think about.
Well, one helpful tool is to really consider the source.
Okay, so who's producing this information?
Right. What are their motivations? What's their track record for accuracy and fairness?
So doing a little background check on the source can help us determine their credibility. Is this a source known for being objective, or do they have a history of bias?
Precisely. And these days, it's not just traditional news outlets we need to be thinking about. We're getting information from social media, blogs, podcasts, even those little memes that go viral.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Those memes can be sneaky.
Right. So we need to apply that same critical lens to everything we consume, constantly asking ourselves, why am I being shown this?
Yeah.
And who benefits from me believing this?
It's like we have to become media detectives.
Exactly. Always looking for clues, following the trail of information back to its source, trying to uncover those hidden biases.
Well, I love that analogy. It makes it feel a little more manageable, we can actually do this.
Absolutely. We have the power to be savvy consumers of information. And another really important strategy is to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay, yeah. So don't just stick to sources that reinforce what you already believe.
Exactly. Step outside that echo chamber and engage with viewpoints that challenge your assumptions, even if it feels a little uncomfortable.
It's about being open to the possibility that we might be wrong, right? That there might be other ways of seeing the world that we haven't even considered.
Exactly. And that can be really tough, especially when we're surrounded by people who share our views.
It's easy to get stuck in that bubble.
It is. But remember, the goal here is to detach from those inherited beliefs, to break free from those prepackaged worldviews we were talking about.
Which includes the worldviews presented to us through the media.
Exactly.
But this all ties back to that idea of self-reflection, doesn't it? It's not just about changing the world around us, it's about changing our internal world, too.
Couldn't have said it better myself. True change starts with each of us individually. with our willingness to question our assumptions and be open to new perspectives.
And that journey of self-reflection, of detaching from those inherited beliefs, it can be challenging. But I think you've also shown us how incredibly rewarding it can be.
It really is. It allows us to become more open-minded, more compassionate, and more connected to the world around us. We start to see things in a whole new light.
It's like we're taking off those old, outdated glasses and putting on a brand new pair.
And suddenly the world is full of color and possibility.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, from navigating cultural differences within faith communities to becoming more conscious consumers of media. And it all boils down to that powerful idea of detaching from inherited beliefs.
It's been a real deep dive.
It has. So as we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to ponder. What inherited beliefs are you carrying with you? And how might detaching from those beliefs empower you to connect with others more authentically and contribute to a more just and compassionate world?
That's a great question to reflect on. And remember, this journey of self-discovery is an ongoing process. So embrace the challenge. You might be surprised by what you uncover.
Thank you all for joining us on this incredible deep dive. We'll see you next time.